This is not going to be an in-depth examination of modern typography or the modern movement, but a rather personal take on some of the typographical aspects of the movement. The symbol of the movement, in a way, is this passage from Jan Chichod's New Typography, to which we'll come back. And I suppose, to some extent, the connection of the movement with Germany is due to the fact that the Fraktur type, far from fading from use, became more and more established after the making of the German Reich or Empire in the 1870s. This is just a very ordinary little popular edition of a novel, showing to what extent the use of this type became casual and frankly rather poor. Notice the absurdly wide word spaces in the fourth line here. And so the great philologist Jakob Grimm made it clear that the use of this ugly type, the Gothic type, was one that would have to go. Let me put that into English. And this is in the introduction to his great dictionary of 1852. In fact, there were always exceptions to the use of Gothic type. If one takes the Baedeker series of guides, which of course were for international consumption, information typography, as one might call it, was always going to be in the normal Roman type. And here is the opening of that Baedeker guide to Berlin in a modern face type, which is very clearly derived from an English model. There was an alternative to the Fraktur Gothic type, and that was a sans serif with capitals and lowercase, which is seen here. And the German type founders made some of the earliest sans serifs with a lowercase of any in Europe. The shortcomings of existing Frakturs were redeemed to some extent by the major calligrapher Rudolf Koch, who produced what was named simply German type, Deutsche Schrift, and it's seen here in a quite small scale edition of the Faust of Goethe. The black is the printing type. The heading in red is almost certainly a woodcut by Koch himself. And if we look at the cover to this little edition, the title here, again, it's almost certainly a woodcut by Rudolf Koch, used on the front board of the cover. Inevitably, perhaps, the whole ethos of the national sentiment behind Gothic got caught up in the new political movements in Germany. Here in the 1930s is an advertisement in a trade paper, which is frankly militaristic in its expression. And in the early 30s, the rather brutal version of a Textura Gothic became identified with the Nazi Party and with its printed materials. One of the bitterest ironies of the whole movement is the fact that English monotype, who were the only source of matrices for the monotype machine, took its German market so seriously that it actually produced a Nazi-style Gothic type, which it called first of all Bismarck and later Sachsenwald, and commissioned design from a designer from a Jewish family who was a refugee in England. And in a way, an almost even bitterer irony is the fact that a lively and coming calligrapher called Hermann Zapf was able to produce this document, about which he never spoke in later years. It's not surprising then that one of the great modernist poets at the beginning of the 20th century, Stefan George, should choose a sans serif type adapted to his own ideas for printing his own poetry. This is, in fact, a commercial sans serif to which George got the founder to add certain alternative forms. The E is an obvious one, T is another. It's not a type design, but it's certainly an attempt to steer typography away from the nationalistic overtones. There were other directions too. Peter Behrens, one of the major designers of the early 20th century, actually took the broad pen seriously enough to make a kind of broad pen Gothic. But of course, the example of his work, which is well known today, is the slogan, the inscription, if you like, dedicating the Reichstag to the German people, filling a space that had always been intended to take an inscription, but it was not actually put there until a critical point in the First World War, when it was added and has been carefully restored ever since. Behrens is interesting too, typographically. This book of his, he was very deeply involved in the new movements in theatre, and living in Darmstadt, he produced this little essay on the place of theatre in the national culture, set entirely in a sans serif type. To my knowledge, this book is the earliest example of a sans serif, again a purely commercial type, being used for the text of a piece of literature. And where Behrens is concerned, I perhaps hardly have to add that, of course, he was also a gifted architect, and his great turbine factory for the Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, the AEG, which still survived the Second World War intact, was a kind of, I suppose it's a take on a classical temple facade. And of course, he not only designed the building, but he was the designer of many of the products of the AEG, like this high-intensity electric fitting. if we're into the modern movement in architecture, then of course the classical symbol, if you like, is the factory building of Walter Gropius, in which all the bases of traditional architecture are stood on their head. The windows don't bear any load at all. That's all taken by a structure within the building. And so this is one of the great showpieces of modernism in architecture. And of course, with Gropius, you come to the Bauhaus, which in 1923, after the war, was compelled, rather unwillingly, to put on view the what it had been doing, if you like, in the field of design generally. And so in the catalogue of that exhibition, you have an essay by the Hungarian Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, setting out the idea of a new typography. Typography is a means of communication. It must be clear communication in the most effective form, effective or penetrating form, if you like. There's a rather nice aspect of this catalogue, which I've never seen pointed out, but there are a lot of E's in that heading, and maybe the printer didn't have so many E's. But given the elemental nature of this typography, the last E could be made up from bits of typographical rule, simply cut up and made into an E, which is a rather nice symbol of the elementary nature of the typeface. There are a number of publications in the 1920s picking up this element, the elementary typography. This is a special issue of a printing journal with contributions by a number of well-known names: Herbert Bayer, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Kurt Schwitters, L. Lisicki, and Jan Tschichold, or Ivan as he puts his name there. And here is the contribution to that journal by Ivan Tschichold. The new typography is concerned with its intentions, zweckbetont. And in the fourth paragraph here, the note that types that have a kind of limited national quality, like Fraktur, are not elementary. If we want to keep to the basis of typography, then there's one type above all that seems appropriate for it. Well, Tschichold, of course, took that term, the new typography, and here is his prospectus for the book that he had been preparing, which I suppose is one of the very earliest handbooks of typography in any language. The New Typography, 1928. And it begins not with typography itself, but with the whole New World picture of after the First World War. And it gives a list of these extraordinary new things that have entered our life in the 20th century. All these new artifacts, clearly airplanes and the telephone, but even New York as a kind of artifact in its own right, all created by the engineer. Where typography is concerned, then the the only letter that matches the spirit of our time is, of course, the so-called grotesque, or block shrift, block letter. And this is my translation, by the way, of the passage, which occurs in the new typography. There were various ways in finding an answer to the use of a basic form in typography, and another one, which clearly had its limitations in practical terms, was devised by Joseph Albers, the great theorist of color theory, in a magazine called Offset. And it was one that gave an idea to Tschichold himself. Tschichol's Transitor, which was produced in the Netherlands, is not completely derived from Albers, but some of the forms certainly were taken over directly. And of course, Bayer produced this theoretical exploration of the possibilities of a geometrical alphabet. And Tschichold produced his own really rather elegant project, which I don't think was ever made into a physical type, for a phonetic version of the alphabet, shown here in German in the lower panel. The top one uses the phonetic form. But of course, the archetype, if you like, for a geometrical sans serif is one of many produced in the late 1920s, is of course the Futura, produced by the Bauer Type Foundry, to designs by Paul Renner, and marketed under the slogan of the type of our time. It began with forms that were perhaps more radical than its later users ever realized. This is one of the sketches for the Futura type, with an A form and a G form, and the M and N, which is a little startling to users of the later form. Like many designers in Germany, Renner thought he had to explain what he was doing. So he says this is the result of a new way of thinking. It's developed from the basic principles of the sans serif. And in fact, if you look at, this is from the specimen I've just shown, and if you look at its details, you see that even in this apparently fairly conventional piece of writing, the N, the R are some of the more experimental forms that were originally offered, but the Bauer Type Foundry hesitated to go ahead with some of these forms and changed them to more conventional ones. One little result of the connection with the Bauer Foundry is that it had the connection with an intertype machine, which was a version of the linotype, and Bauer provided the types for that machine, and for that reason, since intertype was quite big in the United States, the Futura type was available for setting on the intertype and was imported into the USA. And so when it came in a classic series of ads by the agency Doyle Dane Bernbach in the 1960s, the Futura type seemed an ideal way of launching an archetypal German car on the American market, with results that are famous. The German form of sans serif, of course, has this background that I've sketched. Venus here from Bar, in a way, has certain features that were acceptable in Germany and aren't found elsewhere normally. The slightly oblique terminals to letters like E, for example, can be found rather unexpectedly in a type made by English Monotype, which has no name at all. It's simply their series 215. And here it is, with those oblique terminals to E. And frankly, a very Germanic look to it. My hunch, which I've not managed to confirm completely, is that this was made essentially for the German market, which needed a sans serif for its monotype machines. Another German sans serif, which had a big impact, was of course the type known as Accidenzgrotesk, a type for commercial use, made by the Berthold Foundry in Berlin, and which its agents in the English-speaking countries preferred to call by a less difficult word, and called it standard. That, of course, left an impact which is worth documenting briefly. In the early 1960s, a passion for this type developed, and Penguin Books, for example, handing over the design of their covers to a certain Germano Facchetti, found that he wanted standard or Accidenzgrotesk to be used, and very few printers in London could provide it. Desmond Jeffrey, who had already bought his own standard, did a certain number of these headings for the new Penguin look. Another impact of standard was the new traffic signs developed for the motorways and then for all the other main roads in Britain. The transport alphabet of Jock Kinnear and his colleague Margaret Calvert was based on standard. Yes, it has certain features that have been added a little conspicuously. The umbrella handle version of the letter L, the little tail, a bit like Gil Sans, that was added to the A. But effectively this is Accidenzgrotesk. And of course the version of Accidenzgrotesk that changed the world, if you like, was produced by the little type foundry called Haas in the suburbs of Basel in Switzerland. Haas was not doing well financially and came under the protection, or the support, if you like, of Stempel in Frankfurt am Main. And Stempel made matrices for the linotype machine. And so with the massive support of linotype, this Swiss type was rebaptized Helvetica, and the rest is typographical history. I'm going to wind this little survey up with a reference to a type that very nearly killed off monotype, who went into business with de Berny et Peignot in Paris employing a Swiss designer called Adrian Frutiger to make a kind of universal sans serif, which could treat the same basic design in different ways, different widths, different weights. And there's the scheme for the design as set out in the specimen. And there, without the titles, is a very good example of how the same design was exploited. In some ways, it was a triumph of logic, but it was also a great strain for monotype. This is the hot metal specimen of the new universal type. And as it explains, a whole lot of matrices had to be made to carry the new design into the world of hot metal, but that was already a shrinking one, and that certainly produced a strain on monotype, who, for that reason and many others, found it very difficult to continue. But here it is, beautifully drawn, very logical in its forms, and I suppose compared with the basic logic of a geometrical design like Futura, it is less than completely geometrical, a slightly squeezed form of curve. Frutiger is an extraordinary character. He's maybe the only major designer who, having created one major typeface, made another sans serif, which, if anything, is even more widely known and used than the original one. And so we will leave this talk with a salutation to the form of the type sometimes called just Frutiger, but originally was known as Roissy, because that was the name of the little village northeast of Paris, which was more or less annihilated by the making of the new airport called after Charles de Gaulle.